Why do we need an EU reset? And what does that actually mean? Let me guess. Freedom of movement disguised as a youth mobility scheme for the 18 to 34s, despite assurances to the contrary.
It isn't freedom of movement. We have 13 existing youth mobility schemes. We've got a youth mobility scheme with Uruguay, for example. Nobody suggests we've got freedom of movement with Uruguay. I've said it has to be smart. It has to be controlled. That absolutely isn't freedom of movement. And it will also give, by the way, opportunities for young people here in Britain to experience different cultures, to go abroad to work, to go abroad for study. But that is just one aspect, Camilla. What we will be looking at today in these final hours is this deal overall in the national interest, overall in the interests of the British people, and we will only sign it if it does.
I mean, are you still a youth at 34? And who's going to monitor all that? The Home Office are so bad, they don't even know who's coming across the channel via dinghy. Britain is breaking under the strain. They want to continue fishing in our waters, and as our closest neighbours, if they don't buy the fish we catch, I get it that in some way we may well be scuppered, but we sell mainly to them. But there must be other ways of doing things. And of course, the EU want closer ties in defence. Sounds like a good idea, but the devil is in the detail. And a defence pact will serve to further align us to the EU, with potentially even closer links to the European Court of Justice. In my view, the EU is a failing bloc of countries and a failing construct. It's hard enough getting 4 friends to agree on something, let alone 27 countries each with their own vested interests, each with the power of veto. It takes an age to get anything done. And remember Brexit? How could we forget? The EU behaved like a spurned lover. Why would we want to get back together? By all means, be civil and friendly, but it's not as though we've had a child together. It's just wise to get along for the sake of humanity. We don't need to hold hands. But a reset, what exactly are we resetting? I've lost count of the number of times Remainers have said to me, "See, you exchanged people from the EU for people from India and Africa," as if people from India and Africa are worse. What is their point? They're also wrong, because the truth is we never counted the number of people who came to the UK under freedom of movement, so there is actually no real comparison of numbers. Plus, the huge influx of legal migration has been caused by the incompetence of our politicians, and in particular the Tories, who allowed mass migration under their watch to quadruple over 4 years. They have failed us. Instead of ensuring that we had people that we need from wherever, who cares, entering this country, the Tories pretty much took everyone and their dog without balancing it off with the needs of our great country. The system was and still is way too generous. Why does my mum and dad need to come here if I am studying? It's ludicrous. What other country allows that? Here's what I think. Sir Keir Starmer loves the European Union and will literally open the floodgates to do a deal with them for very little in return. Britain will become the dumping ground, if it isn't already, for failed asylum seekers, and rather than closer alignment being good for our borders, will result in us losing total control of them altogether. We don't need more migration, we need less. That is why Britain is breaking. But before we get stuck into the debate, here's what else is coming up today. As Sir Keir Starmer pledges to slash immigration, sounds a bit like smashing the gangs, he tipped to surrender to Brussels as a summit tomorrow to introduce youth mobility scheme will be announced, which could flood Britain with 80 million migrants. Ed Miliband is also considering scaling back plans to erect thousands of pylons across the countryside to reach net zero, reportedly a bid to fight off Reform UK. So, in the Great British Debate this hour, I'm asking, should Labour backtrack on net zero? Criminals will be ordered to fill in potholes and collect the bins instead of going to prison under new government proposals. So for the next Great British Debate, I'm asking, should fewer people go to jail? And former Reform UK MP Rupert Lowe has accused Nigel Farage's party of being the cult of Nigel. Does he have a point? All of that on the way. As ever, send me your thoughts, post your comments, gbnews.com/your say. Right, So let's see what Richard Morley has to say. He's the leader of Rejoin EU, the Rejoin EU party. So am I totally wrong, Richard? Is this not really a slow creep to rejoining the EU without actually rejoining it?
No, I don't think it is. I think that the current circumstances are that Britain needs to have a summit with Europe in order to address a whole range of points. You are concentrating on immigration as being a central issue in your introduction, but there are some very, very other more important points also that need to be discussed. And Britain has a certain number of wishes. It wants certain things from the EU, and the EU is obviously wanting certain things from Britain in return. In other words, there's a trade-off going on to satisfy what Britain wants and what the EU wants, and that is why the summit is taking place.
But that trade-off seems to be all the things that we rejected when we were in the EU. So obviously they are, they're posturing with the fish. They want to be able to fish in our waters. They don't want that to end. And of course, the freedom of movement, which is, when I say a youth mobility scheme for 18 to 34-year-olds, that's a large demographic, isn't it, really?
Yes, but the thing that Britain most wants from Europe at this very vulnerable stage of global politics is a defence deal which would allow British industry to take benefit from European defence expenditure. That is one of the key elements of discussion, which is a want for Britain. Britain also wants to have reduced agricultural barriers because it's finding great difficulty now in shifting its agricultural produce, particularly meats. And they have to have, therefore, a veterinary agreement with the Europe. And Europe has obviously, wants things in return. I mean, we want something, Europe wants something. Now, when you're talking about the youth mobility scheme, Europe wants a great deal more in the youth mobility scheme that Britain's prepared to accept. And so what Britain is doing is actually moderating the European demand. There's a certain amount of carpet dealing going on, and we don't really know yet what the proposals will be from either side. But what we do know is that any agreement is extremely unlikely to occur tomorrow, and all there will be is arrangements for further talks and a more clearer agenda on the scope of those talks.
It's interesting that you say that Britain wants the defence pact with the European Union. Do we? I mean, this sounds like what people were saying when it came to an EU army. Of course, we will work together. We have NATO, and we can all work together in that way. But I don't see why a defence pact would have to involve fish and all the other bits and pieces and bringing us closer and more in line with a lot of the European laws and rules.
But they're very separate arrangements. The defence contracts are all about money. Let's face it, politics is essentially about money, and Britain stands to make a great deal of money if it's allowed to take the European contracts for increased weapons. That is what it wants. Europe doesn't have to give its military orders to Britain. It can very easily do it amongst themselves or with other nations. But Britain wants those contracts. They're very, very valuable contracts, as I'm sure you will appreciate. The agricultural deal is more in Britain's favour than it is in Europe's favour. I don't think Europe has any problems in dealing with its produce, but Britain certainly does now, particularly as the relations with America are, shall we say, fragile. And Britain needs to have an outlet for its produce, which is closer than the other end of the world. So there are wants on both sides.
Yeah, there'll be wants on both sides, but one of the things that we really don't want is even more migration. We have an issue. Well, if we're going to be negotiating on that, I'd like to hear there be some sort of deal where France accepts people who've come via dinghy, accepts them back. But it doesn't sound like the UK are cutting their teeth into that part of the deal. And that's keep the boats coming. There's no, we had the Dublin Agreement, which obviously, in fact, when that was available, hardly anyone went back anywhere. I think there were, 30 people sent back in a space of time. So that's not a big deal. But right now, we have a problem with channel migrants. And the last thing we need are more people coming here.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I wouldn't disagree with what you're saying. One of the most ironic things that's occurred is that throughout history, the English Channel has been a sort of a barrier to migration for people. It was more difficult to cross by sea than it was by land. But in today's world, it's easier to put up a wall like America and Mexico to stop land migration than it is to stop these small boats crossing the channel.
Yeah.
And so therefore, Britain has become extremely vulnerable to migration because of the end of the EU membership means that France no longer cooperates on helping Britain in this way, which it was obliged to do whilst Britain was a member of the European Union. And I think one of the main reasons why Britain should consider rejoining the EU is just for the reasons that you are saying, that we have to control migration, because France can and would assist us were we to be a member again. But at the current circumstances, we can't force France to do anything. We have to simply say, well, if these boats come across, we've got to deal with them. And France says, well, it's your egg, it's not ours.
Well, look, I think we are in agreement that the people shouldn't be coming on, like, you know, that we need to do something about these channel crossings. But I would suggest to Sir Keir Starmer that he needs to use that as part of his negotiation. That's part of the deal. If they want things, then I'd like to see him using that as part of the negotiation. I don't think we need to rejoin the EU for it. I think we could just do a better deal. Listen, Richard, sadly, I've got to leave it there, but it's been really good to talk to you. That is Richard Morley. He is the leader of Rejoin EU. That is a party.